let's take some questions, guys. So you who are in the chat, there's quite a whole lot of you. Wow. I just looked here. We're like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. Wow, there's like 20 people or so in here. Wow, it's like, I don't think we've ever had as many people as this. It's good to have all of you here. So we should have some pretty interesting questions. So yeah, let's kick off the first Q&A. Just get us started, someone. Just feel free to just pitch a question.
Hello, Laura.
Hi.
Hey, so I actually have a question. How would you make use of these measurements while working on a character that's stylized?
You know, when I think of stylization, this is what I think of. I think of a spectrum that goes from one extremity that we would refer to as naturalism. The exact term for the most realistic representation of something, if you want, if you could ever imagine, the proper term for that is naturalism. So I think of stylization as a spectrum that runs from naturalism all the way down to abstraction. And so this is the most realistic representation you could ever have of a face. And well, once you're at this point here, it probably doesn't even look like a face. If you go to the full extent of the spectrum there, probably just looks like a random blob on a page, like a Jackson Pollock painting or something. But in between that is essentially the spectrum of stylization, right? So here we'll call stylization. And so depending where you are on this particular spectrum, you may want to stick closer to those anthropometric values or not, you know? And I consider that I think these are actually valid for a very, very wide range of this spectrum here, right? So what would we have on the spectrum? Well, somewhere about here, maybe, we would have something we would refer as stylized, you know? Like, certainly in the realistic spectrum, but not completely realistic. There's just something about it that's a bit... that has been tweaked a little bit. You know, like for me, when I think of stylization, I think of Horizon. Look at the characters in there. Like they're very realistic, you know, like Horizon as a whole, the art direction of it is certainly on the realistic part of the spectrum, but everything about the art direction isn't fully naturalistic. You know, like when you look, you know, just starting with the colors, it's like the colors are so vibrant that you obviously would not have that in real life to be that bright, you know? So like things like face and what have you there, they've been retouched, you know, like the original scan of the actress there has been retouched to make her features, I suppose I'll use a term that I don't really like in this case, but more appealing, you know? But I don't necessarily mean that she's more beautiful as much as just more in line with the vision, I guess, of who the character is. But so there's been a bit of work on the face, you know, so this is not a game that I consider to be a naturalistic game. It's a game that falls into what you would refer to as stylization. Now, if you continue down this particular spectrum, what would you have? Well, not far from that, very close to that, but not too far from that, right? Then you would get to Deus Ex, you know, like Deus Ex, you know, if you look at Jensen's face, right? You can see that it's clearly more stylized than Horizon. Like there simply is more, I guess, artistic liberties that have been taken with the face in terms of just facial features, just the plane changes, these sorts of things. You know, like there's some very, very angular plane changes happening in a lot of places on the face there. Anyway, well, I'm sure we'll take time to really break this down in great detail at some point in the future there. But the point is that something like this is highly stylized now, you know? Like, we're not in abstraction, but we are certainly in stylization at this point. And, you know, like, as you go down the spectrum, eventually you get to cartoon, and so on and so forth. But as long as you're in that real, what, you know, you would quote-unquote put inside the quote-unquote realistic range, you know? Like as you continue down that spectrum, you know, you would eventually get to, you know, at some point in there, you would have the Simpsons, right? At some point in there, you would have the Simpsons. And so, you know, does anthropometry apply once you're so far down the stylization spectrum that your characters start to look like this? probably not. You know, this is probably too far. You probably wouldn't apply anthropometry to this, but maybe you still would a little bit, right? Like, you know, like the eye still is somewhat roughly at the middle of the head, you know, from top to bottom. So you probably would use anthropometry here a little bit, just as a bit of a sanity check. But for the most part, you really wouldn't be, you know, being adamant about those values being respected there. But I would argue that, like, even as far as something that is stylized this much, I would argue that anthropometric data is still very relevant, you know? But yeah, but there's a transition point where it stops making sense, I suppose, to use anthropometric data, but you can go really, really, really far down this particular spectrum and still have anthropometry be a very, very good tool to use, you know? Like, what else was there? I'm kind of thinking of, I think also where it probably would not apply is in the case of caricatures. You know, I'm kind of thinking of like games. I'm thinking of, so Dishonored, right? If you look at Dishonored, I mean, that's not caricatures, but it is further down the spectrum than Deus Ex, as far as I'm concerned. But even then, like, these faces, they're very realistically proportioned, really. It's like most of the stylization happens more on the secondary volumes and the tertiary volumes, if you will. You know, like, it's not really happening with the primary shapes there. The primary shapes are very, very, very highly realistic. Even a face like this is still very highly realistic. Therefore, I believe that anthropometry is still very, very relevant to this. I guess a game where it would start to break down for me would be a game like Brink. You know, I don't know if you guys remember this game. I think it was never very, very popular, but I was always amazed with the art style. I always thought the art style of this game was really, really fantastic. Brink, video game. So once you're at that point, like, I think you're at the point where you're making faces that are so, like, caricatured, I guess. Characters, maybe? That I don't think that at that point, simply relying on anthropometry makes sense.
Apex as well.
Apex, that's a good one. Let's look. Don't quite have in mind what characters look like again. Yeah. I think these are still relatively realistic in terms of proportion, overall. You know, like, the process of stylizing a face, you know, like, the thing that is good about thinking of a face in terms of primary, secondary, and tertiary volumes. The thing that's really good about that, as we have discussed last week, is that once you start to really think about stylization, you really start to realize that stylization is not a process that you apply on a face overall. I mean, yes, in a very general sense it is, but it really helps to think of stylization as it applies to primary, secondary, and tertiary details. Because stylization can happen to different degrees to these different facial volume levels, if that makes any sense. For example, you know, most of what we consider to be stylized faces is actually really highly realistic faces in terms of primary volumes, on which the secondary and tertiary details have been stylized. And therefore the proportions wind up still being very realistic, you know? Here's an example. So, like, if you think of the movie, like, there's a lot of movies, like, let's say Tintin, which at this point I guess would be an old one.
Sorry, Team Fortress. That one is.
Oh yeah.
Yeah.
That's far down the spectrum for sure. Yeah, I love that game. Oh my god, I love the characters in there too. Yeah, like, so if you think of a movie like Tintin, right? What do you realize? Well, the primary volumes of the face, they're very realistic. Like, they haven't really been stylized too much. What has been stylized? In this case here, it's really the secondary volumes. There's this highly, the secondary volumes have been stripped out, like every superfluous information from the secondary volumes and to a certain extent the tertiary volumes has been removed from this head. But the primary volumes, they're highly realistic, you know? So stylization is not a process that necessarily needs to be applied with equal measure to primary, secondary, and tertiary details. Here's a few other examples of that. I mean, we were looking at Dishonored before, right? Dishonored, it's kind of the same thing. I'm not sure if I still have it open here somewhere. I don't think so. Dishonored characters, right? So I'm not speaking here about what's happening with the bodies there, because I haven't really properly thought of that before. And certainly there too, there's, you know, there is some stylization happening. Some exaggeration happening to the primary volumes, but there's not nearly as much exaggeration happening to the primary volumes as there is exaggeration happening to the tertiary, to the secondary and the tertiary volumes. You know, that's really where the most of it is actually happening. So this is a very common way to stylize something. You keep the primary volumes very realistic, but you simply have a lot of fun with the secondary and tertiary detail levels. It doesn't mean that that's how you have to stylize something, though. It doesn't have to be like that. You could also do it the way that, let's say, Pedro Conti does his stylization. The way that Pedro does his stylization is that he more or less, in a way, flips that around. You know, if you guys look at the characters that he's doing, if you look at the characters that Pedro is actually doing, he uses a very, very different approach here. He is highly stylizing, if you will, the primary details. The primary volumes of the face are highly exaggerated. And so is the secondary details. The secondary details are highly angular in nature. They've been also stripped away of any superfluous information, so they've also been reduced, if you will. But the tertiary details, the skin shading, you know, like there's simply quite a lot of information going on the tertiary detail level, if you will. There's a whole lot of it. There's in fact perhaps even more than there is in reality, which is pretty much what you would refer to as hyper real, I suppose. But yeah, so the process of stylizing something it can be applied in different ways to primary, secondary, and tertiary details. That is simply the choice that you have to make as a creator. Does that answer your question, Peter?
Yeah, pretty well, actually. Thanks.
Thanks for the question. That was a pretty good one.